So, welcome, comrades. Today we are celebrating, of course, the historic defeat of NATO in Afghanistan. United States was defeated there, and because it is a very actually subject, so this is lecture of Bruno about Afghanistan.
Yes, so Afghanistan is an important issue, and it's a pity because most of the time we talk. I mean, the journalists and the media talk about Afghanistan as if Afghanistan was a archaic middle-aged country, and the West is bringing to Afghanistan the light of the progress. And the situation is much more complicated because Afghanistan was mostly ruined by the Western intervention, not only the last one, but a lot of former intervention. If we go back to Friedrich Engels' article about Afghanistan in the middle of the 19th century, Engels wrote that Afghanistan is the cemetery of all empires. And he had in mind then the enormous British defeat in Afghanistan, but also the defeat that from the antiquity all empires had in the land of which is now known as Afghanistan. And the 20th century just made what Engels wrote in the 19th century very actual. So that's one thing. Why Afghanistan is the cemetery of the empires? Of course, in part because it's a mountainous country and it's easy to resist to foreign invaders in a country which has mountain up to 6,000 meters. But not only because of that, also because Afghanistan is a strategic country between, let's say, the Middle East, India, and China. So for all the history, Afghanistan was at the crossroad of different empires, and the mountain of Afghanistan were the place where people were refugee against different empires. And it explains, of course, why Afghanistan is a multi-ethnic and multi-tribal society, just because of this situation. So we have to take that into account, because whatever we think about Afghans and whatever we think about actual the Taliban, we have, of course, to take into account what Friedrich Engels wrote. It means that the Afghan want to be free. The first value they have is freedom against foreign occupation, whatever this occupation is, and whatever their social system is. That's the basic thing we have to take into account. Second thing, Afghanistan was not always in the 20th century a reactionary feudal country, how we suppose very often it was. First of all, because, as I told earlier, Afghanistan was three times in the 19th century invaded by British colonialists, and it made the Afghans very aware what is colonialism and what is imperialism. And that's the reason why when the October Revolution burst in Afghanistan, the king of Afghanistan at that time took the side of Bolsheviks against the reactionary puppet tribe warlords in Central Asia, in former Russian and future Soviet Central Asia, and of course against the British imperialism on the south, which was controlling India. And you have an article of Stalin at that time who wrote that the king of Afghanistan is much more progressive than most of the Western democrats who are supposed to be more progressive than the king of Afghanistan. Of course, the king of Afghanistan at that time was kicked out by a military coup after 10 years of government. I mean, the British couldn't support such a government, but we have to take that into account, because at the beginning of the 20th century, Afghanistan was a Muslim country, that's for sure, but it was a Muslim country where you had different scholars trying to renew the Muslim thinking in a progressive way, concerning question of democracy, concerning question of social equality, concerning question of women, concerning question of freedoms, and so on. You had quite a lot of Afghan scholars which were not only very progressive on the Afghan, let's say, scenery, but they were very well known in all the Muslim world as, let's say, new thinkers. So Afghanistan was not a tabula rasa, as very often people in the West like to think about, because, you know, in the West we have this British-minded way of thinking that Afghanistan was the periphery of the civilized by a British India, and that Afghanistan, they are all tribes, barbarian, because they defeated the British troops. And that's the point. So if most of people are not aware that the caricatural anti-Afghan point of view is a British colonialist made point of view. Of course, it doesn't mean that the situation nowadays in Afghanistan is very good, but we have to think about the fact why it is not good. So as I told you, Afghanistan at the beginning of the 20th century was quite progressive. After, it was not so progressive, but we have to take into account that all over its history up to the end of Soviet Union, Afghanistan was one of the best friends of Soviet Union. Whatever the king was in Afghanistan, you had always good relation between Afghanistan and Soviet Union. You had cooperation with Soviet Union. You had Soviet advisor helping, trying to develop the very backward economy of Afghanistan, and you had students from Afghanistan going to Soviet Union. So Afghanistan, even at the, let's say, the worst time of the most reactionary kings all over the 20th century, was always a society quite open to progressive ideas. And that's very important. Of course, economically, Afghanistan was a very backward country. And this explains why young Afghans were always trying to find a way out that could make Afghanistan be more progressive economically and then socially than the country was. And that's the reason why at the beginning of the 70s, you had the first military coup that proclaimed the republic. It was, of course, a military coup, but we have to take also into account that in backward countries, not only Afghanistan, we had the same situation, let's say, in Upper Volta, now Burkina Faso. We had the same situation in Venezuela with Chavez. We had the same situation in Egypt with Nasser. And we can find a lot of examples in third world countries where the army is the only way out for people of countryside and lower class origin. And it explains why the army in these countries can be very reactionary sometimes, because the officers are, coming from the upper classes. But in the same times, the army can be very progressive, because the lower classes are tending to penetrate the army as the only way out from their archaic life. And that's what happened in Afghanistan at the beginning of the 70s, when the republic was proclaimed. And it was I would say an intermediary situation, which led to the second military coup in 1978, when the communists took power due to the army and proclaimed the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan at that time. The problem with the communists was that they were one party, but united from two parties, the Parsham and the Khalq. And these two parties were having a much different way of looking at things. The Khalq fraction was rather working class party, and the Parsham fraction was rather an intellectual group. But the Parsham fraction had quite a good relation among, let's say, some Soviet leaders in Soviet Union, even if this fraction was in minority in the Khalq party, in the, let's say, Democratic People's Party of Afghanistan. I will not give all the details and the different president Afghanistan had from the beginning up to the end of the communist leadership in Afghanistan, but we have to take into account that all the time you had quite a lot of fractional division in the party, and this, of course, created quite a lot of tension inside the government. Sometimes it created tension with Soviet Union, since each fraction of the party had relation with different leaders in Soviet Union. And it was already the time when Soviet Union was beginning its final crisis, and the different fraction we had in Afghanistan were sometimes linked with the fraction of the Soviet leadership, which were not the most progressive ones. And we have to take that into account. Anyway, the second problem is that, as I told you, some communists were from, let's say, working class origin, and others were rather from intellectual families. And the big problem is that, of course, Afghanistan is a country which is very backward, and the big majority at that time of the population was not living in cities, but was living in the countryside. So of the Afghan communists, they had the good idea, of course, and the idea was very good, to carry on as in other countries which took the socialist road, to begin with the land reform. But they didn't really knew what was going on in the countryside. And, they made it in a quite bureaucratical way. It means that they gave, and that's, of course, positive, land to the poor peasants, the land the big landlords had. But they forget one thing very important in Afghanistan. It's very important to have land. But when you have land without water, it doesn't mean nothing. And they didn't think about the fact that water has to be divided equally among peasants, and the landlords use this because they manage in most of the time to control water still. And controlling water, they were controlling peasants. Because if they don't give the water, the peasant cannot exploit its land. And that's quite important. We have to take that into account, because it shows that the communists were, of course, a minority group, well-intentioned, but not really knowing what was going on in the countryside. Of course, the landlords were very aware of the fact that putting pressures on peasants who received land, they could very easily talk to peasants, oh, these communists are coming to give you land, but they don't even know what you have, what is the situation, and you are still dependent on us. That's one thing. Of course, the second thing was the religious question. As I told you, the Afghan Islam in the 20th century was rather quite progressive comparing to other forms of Islam, but mostly, of course, in cities. In the countryside, the local Islam was very traditional, and it was not only the local Islam, because when we talk now about what is called the Sharia law in Afghanistan, we very often mix two things. We mix the, let's say, strict Islamic interpretation of the law, which is the Sharia, or the form of Sharia that we talk about, we like to talk about in the Western world. But we have in Afghanistan something else. We have what is called the Pushtun Valley, which is the legal code, ethnical code, which exists from the time before Islam, and which is much more reactionary than the, let's say, so-called Sharia. And so when we talk about reactionary laws in Afghanistan, we have always to think that you have two laws. You have the so-called Islamic one mixed with the Pushtun Valley, which is the oldest and much more reactionary, archaic law. But still, there is something which explains why quite a lot of Afghans, for example, now do prefer, especially, of course, in the countryside, the so-called Islamic law than the modern law imported from the West. It's not because one is better, and it's not only because they think that one is better than the other, but because the traditional law in Afghanistan is quick. When you have somebody that kills you, he will be judged within a week. And of course, the judgment, we can criticize it, but the judgment is there. When you have the new tribunals, it takes time. You have briberies, and at the very end, you have a judgment which people don't feel as just. Because it was decided by after a very long time, and it was decided by a judge that are very often considered as at least very far from their problems, and at worst corrupted. So when you understand why Taliban can be popular in the countryside, it's also because their law is very hard, but at least there is a law, and it's functioning very quickly and very well. It means not corrupted and on very clear basis. Of course, we can criticize the system, but we have to take into account that that you prefer. I mean, we can understand people prefer a strict law, which is good for everybody, than a less strict law, but with bribery, corruption, very long bureaucratic decision, and so on. So that's one point we have to take into account. The second point we have to take into account is that, as I told you, there was a fractional fight within the communist movement in Afghanistan. And in 1979, the former president of Afghanistan, Taraki, was killed by a coup which was carried on by Hafizullah Amin. Hafizullah Amin was supposed to be a communist, and even what we can say a hardliner communist. Some people say that maybe he was a foreign agent of the CIA, but we have no proof of that. But anyway, we can assume one thing very clear, is that Hafizullah Amin behaved in a very sectarian way, promoting an ultra, let's say, communist policy in a country which was rather traditional and not open to the to the communist ideas. He even changed the national flag of Afghanistan, which was a three-color flag, by a red flag, quite similar to the Soviet flag. Of course, it's purely symbolic, but still, you can understand that people were not really accustomed in Afghanistan to have a red star flag, and it was an element, of course, of propaganda against them. That's the first thing. And in this situation, the American decided to take the lead. Because especially Zbigniew Brzezinski, the advisor of Carter, had a very diabolic, I would say devilish, rather in English, devilish plan. And what I'm talking about is for sure, I mean, Brzezinski, in an interview with the French newspaper Le Nouvel Observateur in 1998, said that he had a plan, and he managed to realize that its plan, and it worked. And what was his plan? His plan was that the CIA, in common with the Saudis and the Pakistanis, because at that time Pakistan was on the American side. It's not true anymore today, but at that time the Pakistani leadership was linked with very linked with American and with Saudis. So they decided to create CIA and Saudi training bases in Pakistan along the Afghan borders to receive Afghans and teach them how to create military organization, and in the same time training them in the ideology of Wahhabism. Whatever I told you, whatever we can tell about Afghan Islam, the, let's say, archaic one in the countryside, or the much more modern one in the cities, Wahhabism was not known in Afghanistan. So it was a pure importation, and it really ruined up to date, including the Taliban, a lot of elements of the traditional Afghan culture. Whatever we think about the traditional Afghan culture, the brand of Islam we have in Afghanistan from the beginning of the 80s up to today is not an Afghan brand of the Islam. It's the Saudi imported, more or less radical brand of Islam. That's one thing we have to take into account. Anyway, the commandos of the people who were called Mujahideen, it means the partisans of the American and the Saudis in Afghanistan, were told very clear mission. You will never hear about in the Western medias, even the so-called left media. The mission of the of these Mujahideen coming from Afghanistan, trained by CIA, Saudis, and Pakistani intelligence service, was first to go in the countryside, of course, promote their vision of Islam as the only one. But it was not just a theoretical mission, it was a very practical one. Their mission was to kill local teachers in schools and to kill local nurses. because the communist government introduced in Afghanistan, in part of Afghanistan, of course, because it's a very big country, introduced in the countryside nurses to improve the health of people, and teachers to make them learn at least to read and write. And of course, these people were the vanguard of progress in the countryside. And of course, were they communist or not, they were anyway implementing progress within the population of the countryside. So when the CIA decided to kill them or to make them kill, it was sure that it was very it was an open way toward reaction. Of course, they had also to kill the local imams, the religious authorities, which were more or less linked with the government. So we can say that if we have now in Afghanistan a much more reactionary brand of Islam, it's not because the Afghan Islam was so reactionary as it is today. It is that the Afghan Islam is much more reactionary than it was at the time of the first American intervention in Afghanistan. So we have to take that into account. I mean, the American with the Saudis and Pakistani destroyed every root of progressiveness in Afghanistan, not only communist, of course they did with communism, but that sounds quite logical, but they destroyed also the roots of a, let's say, much more progressive Islam, or let's say at least of a much more national Islam. And if we understand that, then we understand that the tragic situation Afghanistan has experienced for the last 40 years is a truly imported reaction. It's not a national reaction, it's a truly imported reaction. And the Afghan did react to that, better or worse, but they were under foreign pressure. And that's the main point we have to think about. Because as soon as the war developed, you had a huge part of Afghans which fled the country, which is logical. And where they were going, they had the choice to go to Iran or to go to Pakistan. Pakistan was for most of them much nearer. So they went to Pakistan. And in Pakistan, they were trained on the new brand of Islam imported by Americans and Saudis. So I would say they were brainwashed for something which has nothing to do with the Afghan tradition, whatever we think about the Afghan tradition. Of course, it's not a very progressive one in a lot of issues, but anyway, it was their tradition, and it was not the most reactionary ones all over. It depends on which aspect. On certain aspects, it was very reactionary, as I told you about the Pushtun Valley. But on other aspects, like some individual freedoms, it was much more advanced than the Saudi brand of Islam. So it's quite complicated, and it has to be studied in a very scientific way, and not only in a purely ideological oriented pro-Western way. So anyway, Afghanistan was plunged in war between those mujahideens and the government army. And of course, the government of Afghanistan was under Hafizullah Amin, which, objectively speaking, was not the best communist you could imagine in a situation like Afghanistan. Was he an agent of foreign intelligence, or was he just a sectarian fanatical? We can discuss about that because we have no element to decide, but the results are the same. Anyway, the Soviet leadership understood that the evolution of Afghanistan is going the wrong way, but they didn't. They were not conscious that it was the plan of the Americans. Brzezinski told that American intervention in Afghanistan began under my own supervision in July 1979. And it was aimed to push the Soviets to intervene in Afghanistan, what they did in December 79. So we have first to know one thing which is very important. It is that the foreign aggression of Afghanistan, the foreign invasion of Afghanistan, didn't begin with the Soviet army, but with the American CIA trained agents and bases and Mujahideen, and Soviet did intervene. Whatever we think about their intervention, Soviet did intervene 6 months later. So it's not a Soviet invasion, it's an American invasion, which was countered 6 months later by the Soviets. That we have to take that into account. Of course, what we have to acknowledge is that the American trap functioned, because Brzezinski told his aim was to push the Soviets to intervene, to make Afghanistan the Soviet Vietnam. And it did work. Now we have to take into account why the Soviets did fall in that trap. And they fall in that trap because Soviet Union, it was at the end of the Brezhnev time, was in deep crisis. I don't speak about the whole society, it's another issue, but let's say the apparatus of the Communist Party of Soviet Union was in deep crisis. And you know what happened later after Brezhnev, Andropov, Chernenko, Gorbachev, and Yeltsin just confirms that the Soviet elite were already in a very a very negative trend. And the decision to intervene in Afghanistan, and the proof that it was, the political apparatus of the Soviet Union was in deep crisis, appears when we notice that the Soviets, who decided the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan? The Soviet intervention in Afghanistan, from the Soviet point of view, I'm not talking about the Afghan point of view, from the Soviet point of view, was purely illegal. Why was it illegal? Because there was no reunion of any Soviet institution, including the political bureau, to send troops to Afghanistan. The decision to send troops in Afghanistan was taken by Brezhnev, the minister of the army, and one or two other members of the Soviet of the political bureau in the Brezhnev bureau, without the acceptation of the political bureau. So it was a purely, so I would say it was a coup. It was decided by 4 or 5 peoples, apart from any Soviet party or state institution, and they decided to send troops to Afghanistan, and in the same time to kill the Hafizullah Amin, and to push on the power the man they liked, these 4 people. It means Babrak Karmal at the head of the Afghan socialist state. When they decided that, they didn't, as I told you, they didn't decide it taking into account Soviet institution. Of course, they didn't decide it consulting the very good Soviet scientists who were specialists of Afghanistan and who were very aware that any foreign troop in Afghanistan will be judged by the majority of Afghan people as an invasion troop. And on this point, we have to understand that Brzezinski and his American colleague were very clever, because, as I told you, they invaded Afghanistan, but in a so subtle way at that time. Later, they will not be so subtle, but at that time, they were subtle. So, I mean, most of the Afghans didn't see the American intervention in Afghanistan. The intervention was going on, but it was not visible. But the aim of this intervention was to provoke the Soviet reaction, who became visible, and it was the beginning of the myth that the Soviet did invade Afghanistan and the Americans just reacted to this invasion, which is purely false. But of course, we have to think about the fact that Soviets made a lot of error. Of course, as soon as the Soviet army arrived in Afghanistan, the Soviet institutions and other members of the Politburo were also in a trap because they couldn't come back. They had to accept the decision and deal with it, and that's why I tried to make the Soviet leadership with the new leadership of Babrak Karmal, which was very unpopular. But Babrak Karmal was very unpopular because, of course, he appeared as a puppet of the Soviets, of the Russians, but he also was representing the tiny minority of the Parsham within the Democratic People's Party of Afghanistan. So the majority of this party was not really recognizing him as let's say, an acceptable communist leader. And of course, it created a situation, a quite tense situation for Soviet army and the Afghan army, because at that time the Afghan army was, of course, still existing and fighting with the Soviets against the different group of mujahideen. So that's one thing. And the war was not going well, let's say, on the Soviet side, up to the moment when Andropov arrived at the top of the Soviet leadership. As we know, Andropov was a KGB member, and he was a quite clever leader in Soviet Union. But unfortunately for the Soviet party, he died quite earlier. But anyway, he knew that Babrak Karmal was not a man which was very popular among Afghan communists and, of course, among Afghan people. And he was very linked with a man in Afghanistan, which is Najibullah, who was, let's say, the local KGB chief, a man who was very popular because in the 70s, before communists took over Afghanistan, he was very, very well known because of his activities on social grounds in favor of women and a lot of different quite popular in Afghanistan initiatives. So when he took the power, it was a good moment for Afghanistan, even if Afghanistan was in war between Soviet and Afghan troops and the Mujahideen supported by Saudis, Pakistanis, and CIA. What was very tragic all over the Islamic world, and that was the second purpose of the American and of Brzezinski, and they succeed also in it. It is that up to the Afghan war, every Muslim, I would say, considered that the central issue for Arabs and Muslims is the Palestine issue. So I would say from the Atlantic Ocean up to Indonesia, the Muslim world was vibrating around the Palestinian issue, which was the symbol of imperialism, of aggression, and of division of the Arab and Islamic world by a tiny creation, the State of Israel. And Afghan situation managed to change that situation, not completely, but at least in a very substantial way, because quite a lot of Muslims in the world began to consider that the main enemy of Islam is not the American imperialism and the Zionist regime. the main enemy is the atheistic Soviet Union. And that's the reason why a lot of Muslim people trained by the Saudi arrived from Algeria, from Africa, from Egypt, from Middle East, and even from Palestine to fight against the country which was given arm to the Palestinians. Or to the allied of the Palestinian, it means the Syrians, the Iraqis, the Libyans, the Algerians, and so on. And that's very important, because we can say that the American trap of Soviet in Afghanistan created a confusion in the mind of maybe not the majority, but a quite large part of the Muslim in the world. And that's very important. And on the propaganda level, it was a pure success for the American imperialism. And then we see why the decision to send troops in Afghanistan, taken by Brezhnev and the Minister of Defense of Soviet Union, was a complete senile decision, not taking into account most elements that would have had to be taken into account if it was a, let's say, scientific and rational decision. Anyway, with Najibullah, the situation improved in a quite visible way, because his government managed to have a much more popularity. The Afghan army began to win battle against the Mujahideen. Afghanistan was much safer at his time, and the policy of Najibullah was much more open-minded, not promoting Marxism-Leninism in a, let's say, frontal way, but taking into account the Marxism-Leninism and progressive Islamic tradition that existed in Afghanistan. And to give you an argument to what I'm talking, in 2008, it means under the American occupation, one of the Kabul radio asked listeners who was the best Afghan leaders in the 20th century. In the 20th century. And of course, you can say that all the listeners of this radio are not, all Afghans. That's for sure. But anyway, 93% of the listener answered that the best leader Afghanistan had in the 20th century was Najibullah. It means the communist leader of the last communist leader in the Republic of Afghanistan. So it means something, even if we have not to think that it's the opinion of the whole Afghanistan, including countryside, but still it includes at least very important proportion of the population in the capital city of Kabul, which is quite important. I mean, the capital city of Kabul is 2 million inhabitants. It's not nothing. So we have to take that into account. And we have to take into account that the communists did lose power in Afghanistan, not because of the Soviet withdrawal of troops. The last Soviet troop left Afghanistan in February 1989. And the communists will still have power up to 1992. So for 3 years, they managed to have the power and to control the army and to fight without any Soviet support. The reason why the communists were defeated in 1992, there are two reasons. The first one is that Yeltsin, who took power in Russia after the collapse of Soviet Union, decided in one day that he will not send any more munition to the Afghan army, gas and oil to Afghanistan. So it was something like a blockade of Afghanistan by Russia, by Yeltsin's Russia. That made, of course, the economical and military situation of Afghanistan unbearable. And this situation pushed one of the local, let's say, communist leader, Dostom, to change camp, and he rebelled against the government, took side of the Mujahideen, and tried to participate in the new government after the communists were defeated. Today, Dostom, now he fled in Afghanistan last week, but Dostom now is on the side of Erdogan, of the Turkish President Erdogan. He's a pure opportunist, but he betrayed communist Afghanistan in 1992. After the Yeltsin's Russia decided to betray Afghanistan and the treaties and the cooperation and the commercial link Afghanistan had with Soviet Union and then with Russia. So if there would have not been the Russian betrayal of Afghanistan in 1992, Najibullah would have stayed in power. So it's very, it's important to tell that the communists were not defeated because the Soviet army was not anymore in Afghanistan. The communists were defeated 3 years after the Soviet army left Afghanistan because of the betrayal of Yeltsin's Russia, of course, under the influence of the United States. So what we had in Afghanistan, apart from all what I said, is that we had a civil war. It means quite a lot of Afghans were on the side of the communists, and quite a lot of the Afghans were on the side of the Mujahideen. And it was, not a situation where you had on one side the Afghan people and on the other side, let's say, a puppet government of an invader. It was much more complicated, and it has to be told because it's a completely different situation we have now. I mean, now we had an occupied power in Afghanistan who left Afghanistan, and in 1 week the government fall. It has nothing to do. In Afghanistan, the Soviets left Afghanistan, and it took 3 years to have a political change in favor of the Mujahideen. So the Najibullah government, whatever we think about them, and I think that the Mujahideen would even agree with me, is a government that had very strong root in its nation and its people. We can discuss how many Afghans were on their side, on which side, but quite a lot of Afghans were on the side of the Najibullah communist government. As we saw last week, it's not the case of the pro-American occupation government, the American and their NATO allies imposed on Afghanistan for the last 20 years. And that's very important. Whatever we think about Taliban on the other side. But anyway, we have to take into account that a pro-imperialist government in Afghanistan couldn't manage to control the country more than 1 week without foreign support. The communists in Afghanistan managed to control the country 3 years without any foreign support. And that's quite a big difference, I guess. And we have to take that into account. We have also to take into account that nowadays, of course, the Communist Party, after the Mujahideen takeover disappeared, the Communist Party in Afghanistan was called the People's Democratic Party. But we have communist group in Afghanistan. We have a little tiny communist Maoist group, and we have the so-called left radicals of Afghanistan who are communist. And they still exist up today. And they always considered that, of course, the Taliban are reactionary, but they are a resistance movement also against imperialism. And we have to take into account this aspect of the situation. Anti-imperialism is one thing, and social progress is something else. And sometimes the two are mixing well. And we can hope, I don't know what will happen, that the anti-imperialist aspect of the Taliban now will push the Taliban to go the way some other reactionary movements in the third world went. I can give you an example. Perón, when he took power in Argentina, was a rather extreme right president, but when he get into power under the pressure of imperialism, he became a much more progressive president. Nasser, when he took power in after the monarchy in Egypt, was not very left oriented, and he began to be more and more leftist oriented. I don't say that the Taliban, it will happen the same with the Taliban, I doubt, but still we have to be very cautious analyzing the thing. Anyway, what we can say is that when the Mujahideen took power in 1992, it was a huge mess in Afghanistan because, the Americans were happy. And when I'm telling that, it's not my opinion, it's the opinion of Hillary Clinton, who is not my friend, as you can suppose. But anyway, she told something very clear, that the Americans were very happy with the fall of Soviet Union, of course. They were very happy that the communists left power in Afghanistan, were destroyed. And then they just didn't bother anymore about what's happening in Afghanistan. So Afghanistan was a ruined country, completely ruined by war country, without any assistance and any help coming from the power, the big power, that pushed Mujahideen to power. So the Mujahideen very quickly began to quarrel between themselves in different factions, who were not anymore, let's say, fighting for so-called Afghan independence and democracy or even Islam. Most of the time, they were just fighting as warlords for powers, killing civilians and trading drug. Since Afghanistan began to be a drug, began to be one of the most important drug trafficking country in the world, which was very good for the CIA because the CIA uses Afghan drugs and Colombian drugs to finance its operation all over the world. In that sense, we can say that the American empire is very the same like the British Empire, who, as you know, financed, organized, and took advantage of the Opium War in China and promoted warlords in China, and American promoted warlords in Afghanistan or paramilitaries in Colombia. So, British imperialism and American imperialism are quite very similar. And that has to be taken also into account. Anyway, the Mujahideen governments up to 1996 were not existing. We can say that between 1992 and 1996, there was no Afghan government. There was an official Afghan government, but not controlling the country. And the country was in the hand of different warlords, making war with each other, making alliance, making new wars. And the situation was a terrible mess. And then arrived the Taliban. Because whatever we can think about the Taliban were young refugees coming from Afghanistan in Pakistan, Uh, and of course, they were trained by the Saudis under the Wahhabi brand of Islam. But also, they were quite pure, I would say, in their intention to purify Afghanistan of the communists, that's for sure. But of course, to purify also Afghanistan of drug traffickers, warlords, and all this mess the Americans introduced in Afghanistan. And they managed to organize themselves to conquer the power because at a certain time, the Americans began to be fed up with the disorganization of Afghanistan, not because they loved suddenly Afghans, but because they had gas interests. It means that at a certain moment, Afghanistan was ungovernable because of those wars between warlords. And looking at the map, you understand that the very important gas fields, especially from Central Asia, but especially from Turkmenistan, were very, interesting for American interests. Not only for money reason, of course, for money reason, because if you take over gas field, you will earn a lot of money. That's very important. But the second aspect of this is that for American imperialism, it was very useful to take Central Asia out of Russian influence. Whatever we think about capitalist Russia, in the middle of the 90s, the plan of the American was that capitalist Russia is not good. It's not enough. Russia must be divided in a lot of little countries to be more easily submitted to American imperialist capitalists. Because, as you know, from the very beginning history of the capitalism, capitalists fight, of course, in common against any threat of social revolution. But as soon as there is no revolution, they compete one with the other. And of course, the American imperialism didn't want to have what happened now in Russia. It means a national Russian capitalism, which would compete with the American interests. So if you take over the gas of Central Asia, you push out the Russian influence in that region, and you promote capitalism, of course, but you promote American capitalism. It is American imperialism. The problem of the American was that if you want to have the gas from Central Asia, you must use Iran. But Iran, as you know, was, whatever you think about the Iranian government, Iran was a post-revolutionary country. Of course, it's not a post-Marxist revolutionary country, but it's a post-revolutionary country anyway. And of course, it's, we can say, an anti-imperialist country, whatever we can think about the social system Iran has. That's another question. So using Iran was impossible. So the only way was to have control of Afghanistan. And then you must finish with the warlords. You must have a relatively unified government. And that's why they pushed, in common with Pakistani intelligence service, they pushed the Taliban to power. Of course, they thought that the Taliban will be their puppets in Afghanistan, just like other mujahideen could have been earlier. And in this point, they failed. Because whatever we can think about the Taliban, I told you they had a very simplistic way of thinking about Islam. They had a very simplistic way of thinking about social relations. They were coming from very backward countryside. All that is true, and in that sense, they were very reactionary. But they were coming from lower classes. That's the first thing we have to take into account. They were not landlords. They were not linked with the higher Afghan privileged class. That's one thing. They were strongly nationalists, and they were not corrupt. So they took power to purify in their way, which is not our way, but in their way, they wanted to purify Afghanistan from all the what they considered as bad. So when they took Kabul, they arrested Najibullah, who was a refugee in the United Nations headquarters in Kabul, and they killed them. So, of course, for us, it's not a very, let's say, progressive decision, especially that they killed him in a very violent way. And it shows, of course, that they were strongly anti-communist, and we have not to deny that. That's of course. But in the same way, they brutalized, let's say, all the warlords and mujahideen and corrupted people, and they systematically destroyed all over Afghanistan the drug fields. First Taliban government purified country from communists, that's right, from warlords, that's also right, and from drug. And of course, they introduced their justice, which, as I told you earlier, was a very simplistic justice, very tough justice, very, we would say, unhuman justice, very reactionary in the way that it was a very punitive justice, but it was an equal justice for everybody. It means you are rich or you are poor. If you are taken with corruption, you will have your hand cut. So rich or poor can have the hand cut. Rich or poor can be repressed for sexual reason or other, independently of class belongings. Of course, it's not the justice we would like to see, but at least for a lot of Afghan people, it was the same justice for everybody. That's the first thing. And the second thing, it was a quick justice. So in 1 week, the judgment was going on. And we have to take into account, because, of course, it's not pure theory. In practice, Afghanistan was at that time a country with a huge amount of arms, a huge amount of criminal gangs. And what the majority of the Afghan wanted at that time was not, the ideal justice and democracy we would like to see. I mean, what the majority of Afghan wanted that time was peace and security. The fact that they can live in their village, not fearing that in the night a gang will arrive in the village, rape the woman, and take every cattle or sheep you find in the village. Theoretically, of course, we can criticize the Taliban's justice, and we have good reason to criticize that. But on the other side, when you are in the situation I described, what you would prefer? A quick, very tough justice for everybody the same, or complete insecurity and war. And injustice, because the corrupted are always freed and the poor are always put in jail or killed. So in that situation, we have to take into account that the Taliban first regime was, I couldn't say, I don't know, we had no social inquiry, but he was relatively popular. It means that it managed to control the country, 90% of the territory, more or less. And at the beginning, apparently from journalists who went there, quite a lot of people considered that Taliban's are maybe not very good, but at least they are better than the ones who were in power before. And concerning, I'm talking, of course, about Mujahideen, not communists, on that way, because the communists were already completely defeated at that time and disorganized. But the problem happened with Taliban because they negotiated with United States the gas pipeline, but they wanted a price for that, which was not the price Americans were ready to pay. Taliban's were, let's say, honest in their intention that Afghan people, Afghanistan as a country, has its own economical interest, and that the interest of Afghanistan has to be pushed forward, and not the interest of American companies. And of course, the negotiation between the Taliban and the American failed at the very end. Because American reintroduced some Mujahideen leaders in the negotiation and told that the pay the American will pay would have to be divided between Taliban and other warlords coming back to Afghanistan, and so on and so on. I mean, Taliban understood that the Americans are just pushing Afghanistan to submit economically and to be back to the warlord situation they eliminated. And that's the reason why the Americans decided to invade Afghanistan, because the plan of invasion of Afghanistan were, and we know that now, were launched before 9/11, not after 9/11. 9/11 was just the pretext. Of course, different theories are existing concerning the 9/11. It's not the issue here, and we will not talk about that. But whatever happened in the 9/11 doesn't change one thing that is sure, that the invasion of Afghanistan was planned before 9/11. And that 9/11 was only the pretext to attack Afghanistan. And if we look at the conditions the Afghan Taliban gave after 9/11 to the American, it appears that it was quite rational what they asked. They asked, American wanted to attack Afghanistan, but of course they didn't tell it that way. They told it, you give us bin Laden and we will not attack us. The Afghan gave three possibilities to the American, but these three possibilities were that you must first give us some proof that bin Laden is responsible of the attack of the 9/11. And when the American didn't accept to give any proof, then the Taliban decided, we will not give you bin Laden because we have you have no elements, rational element that gives us the impression that bin Laden is responsible. We can eventually send him to a judgment of neutral tribunal, not the American tribunal, but a neutral tribunal, which is not Afghan and not American, and the American refused also. And we have to take into account one thing very important. When the American decided to invade officially Afghanistan and passed the decision at the Security Council of the United Nations, even other members of the Security Council accepted the American decision, but under one condition. And this has also to be reminded. The decision was that, of course, American and their allies invade Afghanistan, but within 3 months, they have to show to the members of the Security Council some elements that bin Laden is responsible for the 9/11 attacks. The American invaded Afghanistan, but up to date, they didn't show to the Security Council the documents Security Council members wanted from the Americans. Of course, we can discuss why and what happened at the 9/11. But anyway, we have to take into account that the Taliban asked some elements of proof, whatever we think about them. They didn't receive. They negotiated a neutral ground. That was refused by the United States. For the United States forced invasion under a condition, a very strict condition. The American invaded and never filled the condition of the Security Council members. So we can say that from the very beginning, the American invasion of Afghanistan is purely illegal. But that, of course, at that time, the balance of power in the world was not the one we have now. The balance of power at that time was in favor of American imperialism. So they just ignored other powers' demand. And nobody, Russia, China, France, England, and other members of the Security Council at that time had the force to ask American to answer to the legal decision of the Security Council. So we have to know that, because whatever we think about Taliban, whatever we think about 9/11, up to date, we have no answer what really happened on the 9/11. We have no real answer who is bin Laden. And we have no answer if bin Laden was the real organizer of the 9/11 of the 9/11. We do not know all that, because the American up to now didn't show any proof of what happened then. Of course, it doesn't mean that bin Laden is a good guy, but as we know, bin Laden was first on the American payroll. So it's very logical to think that concerning bin Laden, Americans don't really want we know everything about it. If he was or not the author of the 9/11 is one thing, but we can suppose, and that's for sure, that there are things with bin Laden and Al-Qaeda which the American up to now don't want people in the world to know. That's quite for sure. And when we see how the American behave now in Syria with Al-Qaeda, how the American behaved in Iraq with Al-Qaeda after their invasion, things are more and more unclear concerning relations between Al-Qaeda and the United States. So historians will have a lot of work for the next 100 years on this issue anyway. And we have to think about that also, because there is a lot of doubtful events that happened on that time. So what we can say is that the Americans, when they invaded with their allies, NATO allies, Afghanistan, were officially reacting to the 9/11 and were providing democracy, women's rights, and so-called nation building. What means the nation building in the American propaganda discourse? It means, the open border for foreign capitals, and the creation of a repressive state against everything which is not neoliberal economically, and what form of government the submitted country has is not important, because as you know, Taliban were not really pro-woman, that's right. But first of all, the Mujahideen before Taliban was equally not pro-woman. And the Afghan government, the American promoted after their invasion, is not also pro-woman, because of course you will see on CNN, on BBC, a woman who are minister, who works at the university, who are artists and so on, but that's the upper class. For 95% of the Afghan, and especially 95% of Afghan women, the government that was kicked out last week in Afghanistan was no more progressive than the Taliban government. I mean, for a woman of the countryside, for a woman of the tiny city, or for a woman of the lower classes in Kabul, the situation under the Taliban is not worse than the situation of the pro-American government. So, I mean, it's a very good government for bourgeois women, but it's not a progressive government. The American occupation was not at all positive and progressive for a working class woman. There was no change at all for working class women, except of course for propaganda video and films and so on. But basically, if you look at the Afghan progressive, socialist, or even communist literature, still it exists. You know, they understand that the pro-American government that has been defeated 1 week ago was no more progressive than the Taliban or the Mujahideen or all the governments Afghanistan had after the failure of communists in Afghanistan. Actually, we have to take into account that Afghanistan was a much more progressive country concerning women's rights, but not only women's rights, was a much more progressive country before the communists took the power. Of course, they became more progressive under the communists, but before the progressives were in power, it means at the beginning of the 70s, Afghanistan society was a much more open-minded and progressive society than the society we have. And we have to take into account that the tremendous regression the Afghan society had during the last 40 years is entirely due to American Saudis and Saudis agents that were founded by Americans from July 1979. And I say from July 1979, taking into account that Soviet arrived in Afghanistan in December 1979. So the biggest responsibility in the reactionary evolution of Afghanistan is an American responsibility, linked, of course, with other imperialist power of the NATO, which helped them in Western Europe, like France, like Germany, like England, or in Eastern Europe, like Poland, Czechia, and so on, who also helped Afghanistan to begin the mess we know now. And we have also to take into account, concerning women question, that whatever we think about Saddam Hussein government, that's the same thing, or the Libyan government of Gaddafi, or the Assad government in Syria, and so on, we have, of course, to take into account the fact that women were equal in those countries before the arrival of American troops. And their situation, their bad situation nowadays in Iraq, in Libya, or in rebel zone of Syria, are entirely due to imperialist manipulation, to imperialist aggressions, and to imperialist occupation. So if they would have, if they fought for women's liberty in Afghanistan, they shouldn't have invaded in Iraq. They shouldn't have helped to overthrow Gaddafi, and so on and so on. Because if we look at the history, at the recent history of Arab and Muslim world in the 20th century, we can observe that this society, of course, differently in each country, but generally speaking, the Muslim world was going forward when it was left to its own forces. Afghan kings and later republic, Iraq's republic, Syrian republic, Egypt under Nasser, Sudan before Nimeiri coup, Libya under Gaddafi, Algeria under Ben Bella and later Boumediene, Mali under Traore, under Modibo Keita, excuse me, Guinea under Sékou Touré, Indonesia under Sukarno, and so on and so on and so on. I can give you a lot of Muslim countries where situation was improving for lower classes, where situation were improving for women, where situation was improving for economical and spiritual and intellectual reason, all over the Muslim world, as soon as these countries were more or less independent. But when Americans intervene, or when Americans support a very reactionary government like Saudis, Emiratis, Qataris, and other monarchs, then we see that the situation is regressing. So it's a pure lie when our propaganda, the propaganda we have to support, to hear in the Western world, is trying to pretend that Western aggression in these countries is providing social progress. It's exactly the same thing as in the 19th century colonial world. In the 19th century colonial world, English and French and German and Belgians and Americans were talking that, in Africa, in Arab world, in Latin America, in India, in China, people are backward and that they are bringing civilization. But as soon as they took power in this country, they were always supporting the landlords, they were always supporting the exploiters, they were always supporting the compradors, and they were always repressing people and masses of this country. Whatever it was in China, in Indies, in Africa, in Arab world, in Latin America, it's always the same. Western intervention in the 19th century were officially colonization for civilization, and it was a regress. And in the 20th century, it's under the slogan of democracy, woman right, and something else, and human rights. But it's the same regression as we had in the 19th century. The only difference is that we changed from liberalism to neoliberalism, and we changed from colonialism to neocolonialism. But in fact, it's the same logic. And Afghanistan is the victim of this logic. And on that point, whatever we think of the Taliban, and I don't know what will happen in Afghanistan under the Taliban in the next weeks and months, so I don't really know what to think about the new order that will be introduced in Kabul and in the whole Afghanistan. But anyway, we have to take into account one thing, that Afghanistan now, maybe it will change in 1 month, but Afghanistan now is a sovereign and independent country, which was not the case 1 month ago. This is a positive evolution. It doesn't mean that the everyday life of the Afghan will be very funny. That's another point. But anyway, now Afghans decide between themselves without foreign intervention. Before, every Afghan minister had to be nominated after discussion with Washington, London, and so on and so on. And that's quite a lot of difference. We can hope that the Taliban are aware of one thing, that they must develop economy because the country is completely ruined. that the money the Afghan government has been blocked by the Americans. So a new Afghan government, whatever he will be, has no money and has no way to reconstruct the country. Because Afghanistan is under blockade, like Cuba, like Iran, like North Korea, like a lot of countries. In fact, Afghanistan is now under blockade from the last days, economical blockades. So we can hope that the new Afghan government will be realistic and will cooperate with independent countries which are surrounding Afghanistan. It means China, it means Russia and its ally of Central Asia, it means Iran, and it means Pakistan. Because the very important thing we have to know is that Pakistan was a strongly reactionary country in the 70s, 80s, 90s. But now we have the government of Imran Khan in Pakistan, which is a leftist government, cooperating very strongly with China and Russia, and tending to fight against poverty and also against imperialism. So if we look at countries surrounding Afghanistan, the situation is much better than it was earlier. And we can hope, but it's a hope, of course, we can hope that the Taliban will be at least sufficiently clever to understand that if they want to develop their country, they must cooperate with their neighbors, and they must accept the fact that they need to have people working. And in a country like Afghanistan, when you, in a whole country, when you talk about work, you talk about the work of 100% people. It means the country has to be reconstructed by man and woman. And the government of Afghanistan needs educated people. And he needs not only educated man, but he needs educated woman. So all this could push, it's conditional, could push the new Afghan leader, the Taliban, to behave in a more rational way than they did when they were kicked out from power by the American 20 years ago. Let's hope so. For sure, Afghanistan will not be a socialist country within the next 6 months. Forget about that. But maybe Afghanistan will be a relatively developing country in the next months. And, as soon as you develop, earlier or later, social structures, economical structures are improving. The most important human rights is peace. When you have peace, you can fight for other rights, but you first must begin with peace. That's the first thing we have to have. And let's hope that the imperialists will not try to create Afghanistan as a mess between integrating Eurasia, because with the Belt and Road initiatives, Eurasia is integrating from China up to Belarus in the north, and from China up to Syria in the south. And in the middle of that, you have Afghanistan. So the positive solution would be Afghanistan integrated in this developing trend. The negative thing would be the American using Afghanistan as a drug trafficking and warlord insurrection area against all neighboring countries. But I think that the Pakistan leadership, the Iranian leadership, the Chinese leadership, and the Russian leadership, whatever are their differences, are quite rational about that, and they know how to avoid this new tragedy. That's what I wanted to say, more or less. I don't know if there is if you have questions.
Yes, I have my own question. I have question from chat, and also I have comments. So I read all these things
Sure.
now, and after you can.
Yeah,
Uh,
quite a lot. I
yes, yes,
take
quite
note.
a
I
lot.
take note because
So
I
so
can.
f- so firstly, I have two comments. One, and this is a that Polish left president from Social Democracy, Aleksander Kwaśniewski, who sent Polish troops to Afghanistan,
Ah,
and from 20 years all the time he repeat these lies that it was about bin Laden and about the building democracy and liberation of Afghan women. Recently he said frankly that it was a bullshit, and he knew it was a bullshit. It is only because Poland became a member of NATO, and it was the our obligation to show that we are a good member of NATO. So it's good that we have proof from the Kwaśniewski, who said that he knew it, and all the leaders of the Poland knew it. So it's shown
and
how the
we can suppose
politician.
that all the leader of all NATO countries, in the
Yes, yes,
sense.
but it's only show how these political allies in Poland are corrupted, and how this is
Yeah,
the band of liars.
yeah,
Um, Second comment is you named many the Muslim countries devastating by the USA, and I also want to speak about the Muslim Republic of Soviet Union,
yeah.
like Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, and also this country like Albania or Bosnia,
Uh-huh.
which also
Yeah.
the every every country after the contra-revolution, after the be uh, mm,
Regress.
regress with the collaboration with the Western countries. Okay, so now it is my two question. The first question: could you say something about the society in 80s in Afghanistan? Uh,
In
uh,
80s.
uh, 80s, in the time of the Najibullah.
Ah,
Yes, I am interested about the question the woman. I'm interested about the school, about the building industry, about all these things which we can compare with other states where the socialists take power, and what was the success of this government, because this is very difficult to find information about this. Second question is question about left in 1980s, and what they think about the intervention, Soviet intervention in Afghanistan. Especially, I'm thinking about Trotskyist, about Maoist movement, about all these things that Soviet imperialism, and also could you say something about the communist movement in Afghanistan, because you named the Maoist organization. What was their position? Because for my point of view, it is maybe the intervention in Soviet intervention in Afghanistan was a mistake, but in the time when this Soviet intervention was started,
yeah.
and we have in one way the communist government supported by the Soviet and other CIA fanatics, of
Yes,
course
yes.
we have to support. Okay, now I will read the question from chat. It is Venceremos Allende. Uh, how can
Clear.
we reestablish a progressive path for this broken society in Afghanistan? And now is the three questions from Yota Z1. Taliban is a foreign, not Afghan force. They entered Afghanistan from Pakistan in 1994 and later.
Yeah.
What are Pakistani interests in destabilization of Afghanistan now in 2021? Second question: Taliban face a new reality. They lack the funds. They manage the country and are facing a rebellion. EMF suspends Afghanistan access. Oh, you said this.
Yes.
Access to resources, and US stole billions in Afghanistan assets. Any thoughts? F- Effie Bruno, trading the arms US left behind is not very convincing answer. And next, the last question is in Poland, in Polish language. Uh, could you ask Bruno to repeat this situation about Leszek Miller? Because one time you said that Leszek Miller was in CIA,
CIA.
Euro CIA, more than 24 hours. So the
Yeah, yeah,
question is,
yeah.
where, what is the date of this meeting? Miller with CIA. Okay,
Okay.
so I let you answer.
So, yes, concerning the Najibullah government, of course, it was a very progressive, as I told you, government. And that's the reason why so many people, at least in Kabul city, remembers, as I told you from the radio of Kabul, this government as a very positive and as the most positive government Afghanistan had. But of course, we have to take into account that it was wartime. So the situation in Kabul was more or less under control, but in the countryside, the country was under fire. And that's, of course, the reason why you cannot. The policy of the government was maybe very progressive in the area. The government did really control towns and some part of the countryside, but most of the country couldn't, let's say, experience this government as a country building government because it was under war. And, you know, Afghanistan is a very poor country, and the government had no financial possibility to really build and develop the country because the few resources it had to use for army. So you know, that's a situation we find in other countries. You know, when you have chaos and war, it's very difficult. And it's very easy, in fact, for the imperialists to use the situation to show, oh, you know, this government is inefficient. You know, when you had civil war in Russia in the 20s, you had famine in Russia at that time. And of course, all the anti-communist propaganda was saying, you know, the Bolsheviks are not unable to feed their people. Of course, they were unable to feed their people because the country was under war and couldn't produce enough food to feed people. So it was the situation under the Najib government. So that's the reason, of course, that a lot of Afghans, especially in the countryside, cannot have any opinion of the Najibullah government because they couldn't experience what was the sense of their policy. And we have something. We have the big problem, you know, of Afghanistan now is that the Afghan society is a society with amnesia. It means young Afghans or even middle-aged Afghan do not know what was Afghanistan before communism, do not know what the communists did in the area they were controlling, Kabul and so on, and they have no way to compare. What they know is the discourse of the occupiers, the Americans and pro-American proxies, or the discourse of the Taliban. But they have no real way to know their own history, which is a contradictory history. But they don't know their own history. You know, American created in Afghanistan a real tabula rasa. In the mentality of the two last generations. And it's, of course, a big tragedy. And, you know, I would say that the American empire functions like earlier colonialists on amnesia. Because, for a lot of Afghan people, now, whatever you think about the Taliban are representing the Afghan tradition, which is partly true, but partly false, because they were trained under the Saudi brand of Islam in Pakistan, which has nothing to do with the Afghan brand. But when you talk up people in Afghanistan, they say, no, the Taliban are traditionalists. Yes, but which are their tradition? Their tradition are not purely Afghan. Their tradition is partly imported. Of course, the situation is different in a far countryside of Afghanistan, where local Talibans can be linked with the Afghan tradition, whatever we think about the Afghan tradition. But the Afghan coming from Pakistan, the Afghan refugee coming from Pakistan, maybe they think they would behave the traditional Afghan way, but in a certain sense, it's mixed up with imported Saudi Wahhabi influences, which had nothing to do with Afghan tradition. Now, you ask about the Soviet intervention. Of course, and I think that now all communists, are they, let's say, pro-Soviet or Maoist, would accept. It's not the case of some Trotskyists, let's say, but at least the Maoists and the pro-Soviet, that the communist government of Najibullah especially was a progressive government, and that this has to be said. But of course, at that time, it was not so, because you had the Soviet-China split. And when the Soviet army was introduced in Afghanistan, China was against. And you had in Afghanistan, not very important, but you had in Afghanistan a Maoist movement. And the Maoists in Afghanistan organized their own guerrilla against the Soviets. They, of course, dreamed that they will, little by little, regroup all the anti-Soviet fighters under their umbrella. But in fact, of course, it never happened, and it was rather the contrary. The more the war was developing, the more the reactionary factions were developing, and the less the Maoists were in capacity to carry on their own activity. And at the very end, as we know, when the communist government collapsed, the Mujahideen took over, and the Maoists were out of the track, exactly like the pro-Soviet communists were at the same situation. So we have to take that into account. And looking back at the history, even the Maoists in Afghanistan understand that they behave the wrong way. I mean, that whatever we think about Soviet Union at that time, Soviet leadership and Soviet system at that time, the biggest danger for colonial people, and especially Afghan people, was not Soviet Union, but rather American. But the Chinese did this error at that time, that they thought that the Soviet, what they call social imperialism, was stronger than it was, and that the American imperialism was weaker than it was. Of course, now things appear on the right proportion looking back, but of course the error that were made at that time were made, and you have to take that into account. Of course, what says one of the people who asked me question that Afghan society is a broken society is a very, very good definition of the situation. It's a completely broken society. And even I'm asking myself if it is a society, or let's say different groups all over the country, which cannot be called society. But anyway, it's something like a broken society. And of course, you don't rebuild it after 40 years of ruin. And as I told earlier, after 40 years of amnesia provided and promoted by the invaders, you cannot reconstruct that in one second, and it will take time. If you are optimistic, and I would like to be optimistic, but I don't know, and I will not make prophecy because I'm not a prophet. As I told you earlier, if you are optimistic, we can think the Taliban are aware that the country, whatever they dream of, must be rebuilt. And if Afghanistan has to be rebuilt, it needs all educated people, including women, to be part of the reconstruction, because without that, the country will never be rebuilt, and the country will fall back to wars. Because when the situation is catastrophic in a country, of course you have wars and warlords and a very bad situation. So if you are a little bit realistic, just a little bit realistic about the situation, you must take into account the necessity to have peace with your neighbors. And for example, what it means. If you want to have peace with Iran, then you need to have the pro-Iranian minority in Afghanistan, the Hazara, who are Shias, on your side. And this means, whatever you think about Islam and Shias and Sunni, but it means that you have to have them on your side, and to learn how to make compromise with a group which is not really on the side of the Taliban. And if you begin to make compromise with some minority, then you have to make compromise and to learn how to make compromise with other groups. And you have to make compromise with educated people. And you have to make compromise with city people, because Talibans are mostly countryside people. But now, the city developed under war. And, people of the war inside the cities are not, on the same ideological line as the Talibans coming from the countryside are. So you have to take all that into account. And we can hope that the Taliban, as soon as they won the war, showed at least one thing: they are not complete idiots. Because if you can organize yourself during 20 years to organize an army that was able to take the country in a couple of days, it means you are not complete idiot. So if you're not complete idiot, we can hope that the intelligence will prevail. And the intelligence means also to take into account economy. And if you take into account economy, you must at least, I would not say create a progressive social structure, but something tending toward progress. Let's hope so. But I'm, of course, for the moment, I cannot tell you. This is, of course, there are leftist movement in Afghanistan. I would hope the Taliban will not try to eliminate them, but I'm not sure. I had contact with the so-called, they are named left radicals of Afghanistan, but I have no news from them for the last weeks, and I really don't know what will they do and what is their situation now. I know that there is the Communist Maoist Party in Afghanistan, but I don't know what will they do. let's hope things will go in the good direction, but let's hope so. Concerning Taliban as a foreign group, it's partly true, partly not. Partly because, of course, they were trained in Pakistan. And as I told you, they were trained under Saudi schools. And that's right. But in the same time, they were not, they were in Pakistan, but they were in the Pushtun area of Pakistan. And you know, the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan is a pure artificial border because it was a border created by the British colonialists, and it divided tribes and people from the same nationality. So you have Pushtun on the Afghan side and you have Pushtun on the Pakistani side. And the Pushtun province of Afghanistan, of Pakistan, is the territory where the Afghan refugees were. So they were not in a real foreign countries. They were Pushtuns in a Pushtun countries with more or less the same culture, the same behavior. And this explains especially why you have Afghan Pushtun, Afghan Talibans we know about, but you have Pakistani Taliban in the Khyber Pass province in the Pakistan Pushtunistan. You have Talibans, local Talibans, that take part in the local government because Pakistan is a federal country, and the Pushtun province of Pakistan is partly under the power of local Talibans. And what is important to know, when you make politics, you have to be very realistic. And you have to understand what the real people how the real people is functioning. And as I told earlier, Imran Khan is the premier of Pakistan. He is somebody who knows very well the Western world because he was a cricket player in England. But in the same time, he discovered how the Western society, the British society, was unfit to the real developing world, especially, of course, unfit to the Pakistan, his country. So when he came back to Pakistan, he created a very tiny party, but now the party is in power. And it's a leftist party, let's say progressive Muslim party, which is very linked, and it can be very strange for you, but which is very linked not only with China, but is very linked with the Communist Party of China. Imran Khan was not only received by the government of China, Imran Khan was not only received by the officially communist leader of China, but he was received by the Marxist-Leninist school inside the CPC. And he made lectures there, and he is advocating that that China is a country very popular in China from the very beginning of Pakistan's history in the 50s, and that the way the Chinese did fight against poverty is an example for the Chinese people. So that's one thing. But why I told that? Because you must understand that Imran Khan is also a Pushtun. And Imran Khan, before taking power in the whole Pakistan, was in power in the Pushtun area. And he was in power in cooperation with the local Taliban. So he's capable of promoting a leftist, progressive, socially speaking, a leftist, progressive, feminine speaking policy with an anti-imperialist policy and cooperating with the local Taliban because they have roots in the country he is leading. So we can hope that if he managed to make Taliban of Pakistan evolving in a much more progressive way than at the very beginning of the story, we can hope, but it's not for sure, we can hope he will use the Pakistani Taliban to push the Pakistan in the right direction, in the right track. We can hope, but it's very complicated because in Afghanistan, Pakistan, for the border reason I told you about earlier, is not very popular. A lot of Afghan people think that the real border between Pakistan and Afghanistan should not be the one existing now since the British, but the Afghan border should be pushed a little bit eastward. So all Pushtun will be in Afghanistan. So it's not really easy thing to push even progressive Pakistani influence in Afghanistan, taking this into account. But let's hope that Imran Khan will manage to push Afghanistan in the good direction, since he is a very clever man, because he succeeded to push Pakistan in a complete other geopolitical direction than before, because Pakistan, as I told you earlier, was completely on the side of the American. And what is important is that what changed in Pakistan, it's not only Imran Khan, it's not only the society of Pakistan, because the society of Pakistan understood, the drone bombing you had in Afghanistan, you had also in Pakistan. I mean, U.S. Army bombed also different Pakistani villages. So, the Pakistani public opinion is more and more anti-American, anti-US, and anti-imperialist, and that's important. And it explains also the success of Imran Khan. But the SEI, I mean, the intelligence service of Pakistan, was completely on the side of the American during all the Afghan wars. But after the Afghan wars, after 1992, the Pakistan was also left by the Americans. And they didn't help Pakistan to rebuild its border area and so on and so on. And that's, to a certain extent at least, why at least some intelligence officers, Pakistani officers, discovered that their American friends were not really so friendly. And that's why the Pakistani intelligence, partly at least, changed its mind and went rather on the Chinese track and not on the American track. And what happens now in Afghanistan must push them more and more in that direction. And, Pakistan now is for sure an anti-Western country. And of course, I can suppose that the CIA is not happy with that, and that they will try to kill Imran Khan, as they did with Benazir Bhutto, who was killed some years ago, because she was a quite progressive woman in Pakistan. And the Bhutto dynasty, whatever we think about, is quite socially progressive, and especially if you have girls on the forefront and women, it means something in such country like Pakistan. So I would be Imran Khan. I would have a very strong guard to survive, because I think he's on the killing list of the CIA. I would be the CIA, I would kill him. Fortunately, I'm not the CIA, but I would be on their point of view, I would kill Imran Khan, because he's a real danger for American imperialism in decay. And that's very important. of course, the situation, the economy, the basic situation is economy. Afghanistan is now, as you said, on IMF blockade, on US blockade. And the only solution they have is to find alternative. And, looking at the map, the alternative is China, because Iran is under blockade, so it cannot really help. So China and Pakistan, and eventually Russia, can help Afghanistan to survive under this blockade, and this will change the future of Afghanistan, and I hope that it will change the behaviors of the Taliban, who understood that the American used them and left them alone later. And that's important. Concerning Leszek Miller, I have not the exact date, but what is important is that he was in the CIA headquarters for 24 hours before the SLD government in 1993 was formed. So in a certain sense, because Leszek Miller was supposed to be, if we look in 1989 in Poland, when the PZPR, the party, was dissolved, it was replaced by a very tiny party, which at that time was called the Social Democracy of the Republic of Poland, and now it's SLD, Left Alliance, Left Democratic Alliance, but it's the same political group. And there was something like a fake division of work. At that time, Kwaśniewski, the future president of Poland, was the president of the new party, and Leszek Miller was the secretary of the party. And apparently, Kwaśniewski was the social liberal good guy, pro-Western and so on. And Leszek Miller was in charge, because at his happened, it was in charge to, let's say, take over the more or less old communists in the party, so they will not disturb the process of transformation toward capitalism. So up to 1993, Leszek Miller has the image of, a tough, hardliner post-communist in front of the social liberal or liberal Kwaśniewski. In fact, as it appeared later, it was a division of work, but to create a pseudo-left working on the interest of the imperialists and globalized capitalists. But anyway, I suppose that the American wanted to be sure that Miller is not, let's say, communist anymore, and they took him in Washington before the SLD SDRP government was formed to train him on the right direction, and they visibly trained him in a quite good way, since the so-called left fraction of the SDRP never tried to stop the neoliberal reforms. I guess the CIA has quite a lot of, they have always information about every people they want to control. And, quite a lot of people have different things that can help to control them, financial, sexual, or whatever you want. And I guess that they had something on Leszek Miller to make pressure on him, so he would still be the good guy, neutralizing communists inside the Polish left. So the right wing of the so-called left can manage to push forward the neoliberal reforms that were introduced by Balcerowicz, and that were, of course, promoted also by the so-called left. And eventually by Leszek Miller when he formed later the government. He was no more leftist than Kwaśniewski, Oleksy, and all that bunch of opportunists who created out of the PZPR a little tiny party. We have always to remember concerning Polish issues that in 1989, the PZPR, the Polish United Workers' Party, had 2 million members. And then when this party was dissolved and replaced by the SDRP, the SDRP had only 65,000 members. It means that 1,900,000 were didn't join the new party, which means they were kicked out of politics in a certain way. So we had a real purification in the bourgeois sense of the Polish left carried on at the time, a successful purification carried on by Rakowski, by Jaruzelski, by Oleksy, by Kwaśniewski, and later by Leszek Miller, and a lot of others, of course. Taking into account that Balcerowicz was also in 1979 lecturer at the Marxist-Leninist Institute of the Central Committee. He was the vanguard of neoliberalism inside the communist ranks.
There is last question, not about Afghanistan. Tavish Hari asked, any opinions on the work of Albert Szymański?
Albert Szymański.
I check him in Google. It is initiative anti-communism. So it is academic from USA who fight with.
It's from USA. Yeah, I will check, but honestly speaking, I cannot.
No, I also didn't knew about him, but is anti-communism.
Yeah, that's a very good point because it shows that I don't know everything, and it's very good to know that I don't know everything, because sometimes when you look at knowing things, people begin to believe you are a god, and I'm not a god.
And he writes that he's Polish-American Marxist-Leninist sociologist.
He's Marxist-Leninist?
It's a commentator. Polish-American Marxist-Leninist sociologist.
Okay, I will check, because it's very interesting for me to discover that man. But I will try to know.
Maybe he speaks Polish.
Yeah, I guess so. Yes, but I will try to know better about him. And thank you for the one who informed me about it, because it means that I have to learn something, and I like to learn something.
It's good to know that the Polish American is not only Zbigniew Brzeziński and his son.
And his son, yeah, and his sister on the radio, TV, or TV show in the United States.
I don't know. Okay, Bruno, thank you very much. I will finish this, but I have questions, so not go away.